it's easy to work with when they're smaller bites. Okay, so let's switch now. So Leeville got hit very hard, but it's also where the first, from the 1893 hurricane, people relocated to, and there were markers there. Tell us about this 1893 comparison.
Oh yeah, well, okay, the hurricane of 1893, again, you had these people taking advantage of the great estuaries we have around the Grand Isle, Shanghai, Manada area. And so you had these families there.
I'm sorry. I'm going to be doing this with the Sicilian episode, so maybe throw in. You can tell me about everybody, but make sure we throw a little Italian stuff in there.
Okay, for sure.
Okay.
People gravitated to Shanghai because it supplied a lot of the seafood to New Orleans. In fact, you used to go up Barataria Bay and hit the canal on the West Bank, and the market was right where Audubon Park is right now. And so all of the people, the big immigrations to New Orleans ended up being at Shanghai. So you had Acadians, you had French from France, you had even some English people. You know, the more Sicilians came into the United States through New Orleans than anywhere else. We had a number of Sicilian families down there, the Pisciolas, the other Italian families, along with the French. But it was basically at Shanghai, it was a French language with Catholic umbrella as compared to like in the East Coast where you had Protestant English. It also was French and Catholic. And so all of the Latin tongues, the Spanish that showed up, we had the Islanos that were there, also had Native Americans, very diverse group of people living side by side. You had people, I talked to a lady, the family worked for a farm in Thibodeau, and the family moved to Grand Isle. They talked about how great life was. Not that they weren't any richer, but living on an island that throws food at you is so much easier than living anywhere else. And that's what's the attraction. It continues to be an attraction in South Louisiana. I go to Leeville, I can still go catch fish, you know, and still do some great things, but there's not much of Leeville left. But in my family, it's like a lot of families in South Louisiana. People talk about when you live next to the flooding, you want to flood. Well, actually, 7 out of my 8 great-grandparents were right there at the beach at Shanghai, right there at the Gulf. After Hurricane of 1893, 3 out of my 4 grandparents were in Leeville, 12 miles from the coast, and one of my grandparents moved to Cutoff, which was some 30 miles from the coast. Then after the storms in Leeville, my mother was born in Golden Meadow, my father in Cutoff. Golden Meadow, 30 miles, well, 22 miles from the coast, and my father in Cutoff, 30 to 35 miles from the coast. And if we had not built the levee system that we have, my kids would have been born someplace further north, but they were born in Cutoff. But only because the levee system is there, and the threat is there, and we have been able to maintain that population. Still working out of Port Fourchon, supplying 90% support for deep offshore oil. That port exists, but everybody lives further north. So we have managed, I think, if we see global warming to a large degree, that people will do kind of what we've done in our area. We still do business where business needs to be done, but people don't live where the risks are. We can do the business, make money, but have people further north and have this type of system work.
So tell me about the hurricane. You were the chair. If you would, open up by saying you were the chair of this centennial, right, and what you guys did, and talk about the cemetery and talk about the exhibits up in Galliano.
Yeah, well, you know, when I was a kid, 5 years old, I can still remember my grandfather was telling my cousin who was writing a report, and of course all of the older people, my grandparents, just spoke French, and he's talking to my cousin explaining what happened in the hurricane of 1893. Now my grandfather, who was telling the story, and then I'm 5 years old this time, but he was born February 1st, 1893, so he was basically repeating what his father told him. But that storm was just, it was a terrible storm. Again, killed half the population, but the biggest percentage of people who died were, biggest percentage were kids, next highest percentage were women, and the least high percentage of loss of life were men. And that's simply for that storm, the entire community was flooded. Who could hold on longer to something that was floating? That determined whether you survived or didn't survive. And it was sheer luck. And so you had the storm, and we, you know, the people, the survivors buried, if they had, they knew, but there were a lot of people, the entire family died. So you had a mass grave at the cemetery, and we put up a monument in there to those people and to the storm and to the the determination of the survivors to continue and keep their families going. So that's at Cheyenne Caminada, at the graveyard, the old graveyard. You'll see the monument, and it gets knocked down every storm, and I don't think we've got it back up yet after the Ida, but we're going to get that thing back up there. But again, I talk about my grandfather telling the story. I've always remembered it, we've always repeated it, but then it was being repeated a lot less. The 100-year anniversary of the storm in 1993 was coming up. So in 1992, I put an article in the paper, and I got 5 people who were also thinking of doing something. So we did a centennial. It was a 3-day event starting at the cemetery, Cheyenne Caminada, then going to Grand Isle, then we went up to the Cutoff Youth Center and invited all of our friends and relatives from all over the place who experienced the storm. And again, the storm killed some hamlets in Oshabayu in Terrebonne Parish, a hamlet of 60 fishermen. All of them died from the storm. Killed a whole bunch of people in Terrebonne, did what it did in Cheyenne, went on to Blackman, took a number of lives over there and destroyed a lot of Blackman, and went on actually to Mississippi and caused some damage there. So the storm went along the coast, and there was a front that hit October 1st that year. So it didn't actually penetrate the coast, it went along that front line and never did affect New Orleans. And a lot of the help came about a week later. Boats from New Orleans came to help out the people. But then we went to the cemetery for the centennial, started at the cemetery. Then we went up to Leeville, looked at some of the sites, and we had a gentleman at a hotel. He actually had a model of Leeville that he had done. And of course, the storms in the past took the model away. And then we did the centennial, and we had some money left over. We did an original play, and we sold books, and we actually made money. And this was it was a great event. We documented a lot of the history and things that had been forgotten, and we started telling the stories again. An original play written by John Ducey. It was an award-winning play. First play he ever wrote, and we had the play, and we sold out 6 performances of 1,200 people, and it just made you understand how terrible that night was.
The displays. Walk me through the displays in the library.
Okay. Well, in there, you had a couple of them to show where the town was, the layout of the town. Most of Leeville was actually on the east side of the bayou, and right now there's nothing there. All the storms have taken it away. Then talking about the different types of fishing, we had sailors. Our people in 1893 were using seines and sailboats to catch shrimp, but oysters, and bring those things to New Orleans. Then the layout of the town, the way we built the houses. People use mud, and what kind of materials you use what was around. We used mud, palmetto, and with those things and some cypress, you could build your house, build your mud oven, and showed those displays. And then just this, we had a picture display at the Centennial, and made several books that we sold through the library of pictures that were from the 1890s all the way till 1940.
Tell me about the bell.
The bell. There was a church at Cheyenne. Now remember, Grand Isle at that time had four plantations on Grand Isle, so it wasn't subdivided. It was just those operations. So the people lived actually at Cheyenne. That's where the 1,700 people lived, and there was a school and there was a church. And again, everybody went to church. In fact, the people who would go to Grand Isle, because they eventually started having a hotel in Grand Isle, and so some of the rich people from New Orleans. I mean, think about New Orleans in the middle of summertime in 1893. Just throwing their stuff in the middle of the street. So richer people sent their families to Grand Isle for vacations to get away from the stink of the city during the summertime. And so they would go to the church at that Cheyenne Caminada. And we had the famous author who wrote I forget the name of it.
Well, tell me about the priest ringing the bell.
Yeah, well, during the storm, the priest stayed in the church, and some people say that he rang the bell to warn the people, but after that, the wind just made the bell ring, and it was eventually lost and found and searched for, and someone had taken the bell to Westwego. And one of the stories that it was unearthed in Westwego and brought back to Grand Isle, where a lot of the descendants are still around. So that's the bell that sits there at the Grand Isle Church. Here's the bell that the people at Cheyenne had put together for the church at Cheyenne Caminada.
And tell me a little bit about the Pisciola. Is that not?
Pisciola?
Pisciola, and the company money.
Oh, I don't remember the
Oh, okay.
story.
Well, just whatever you got
But the
there.
PCO, yeah. But yeah, the PCOs had a store at Grand Island. It had a store again in Leeville, and then another store in Golden Meadow. And so the PCOs were an integral part, like all the people were at the Cheyenne group all the way up there. In fact, PCOla, because the group, the survivors of Cheyenne, all we stayed connected to boats and that lifestyle and speaking French and just a different kind of culture. And our people were starting to get educated in school, but a lot of people didn't go to college because going to New Orleans or Baton Rouge, it was like another world. So it was actually Marco Pisciola, who was the representative, did the legislation that formed Nichols State University in Thibodeau, so the people from down the bayou wouldn't have to go as far and could afford to get a college education. And I got my degree from Nichols doing exactly that, working on the shrimp boat during the summertime, making enough money that I could go to Nichols and get a degree. And a lot of our people in my generation, it was the way we could afford to go to college and get a degree and move on to things.
Give me, I got some video of Billy Nungesser talking about the marker he put up. So give me a transition. Talk to me about Lieutenant Governor and tourism coming down.
Yeah. Well, again, the Lieutenant Governor Billy Nungesser was, in Blackman Parish, past president, and very aware of the history of Blackman. And he had Harris,
Paul.
Harris. Okay. Well, Lieutenant Governor Nungesser was aware of the story of Paul Harris. Paul Harris actually was in Blackman Parish when the hurricane hit, and he survived, and that made a mark on him in what he ended up doing with Rotary. And I happened to be in Rotary, and actually Rotary sent me on a professional exchange to France. I spent 5 weeks in France and still in touch with, not just this morning, one of the friends of ours from France is retiring, and I've been staying in touch with those people since 1986. Paul Harris all tied into our lives and the things that Rotary does for people. But he set up this worldwide organization, and part of his experience is understanding what it took with disasters that happened and what happened with the Cheyenne storm that affected Blackman Parish. There was the stories. There was one little girl. The people from Cheyenne heard that this girl had been picked up by some fishermen in Blackman, and they raised her. So 10 years later, they went and heard about the story and made contact, and there was some mole, a certain place of the body, and they identified it, but she had basically grown up with the other family, and they agreed to let her continue staying with that other family. Because this storm just separated everything. There was a Cladamarital storm that was, when the storm hit, we had a north wind blowing. It started with a south wind, and then the switched around and pushed things out into the Gulf. He survived on a floating roof, and oranges, satsumas that were floating that was the only fresh water he could get, and he survived 8 days on that roof. Now, sadly, he survived and was living in Leeville. And when the yellow fever hit New Orleans, it was brought down to Leeville, and so he passed away with.
Tell me, oranges are still big.
So oranges are still big.
Say a little bit about oranges.
Well, oranges, once they started growing in our area, all over coastal Louisiana, but Blackman Parish really specialized in growing oranges, and it's just been a mainstay. And my seasons, when I do my seasons, I do basically I look for strawberries during the spring, and then the summertime the watermelons. And then the fall comes, and the oranges and satsumas that we grow in South Louisiana are what take me through the wintertime and get to the strawberries the next season. But they played an important part. Blackman has had its Orange Festival for years, and it's an important part of South Louisiana.
That was good. All right. Hold on.